Okay, very good evening to everybody this evening. Glad to have you with us. Wednesday night, an adult Bible class. We are studying the book of Exodus. We are in chapter 25. If you want to go ahead and open up your Bibles to chapter 25 of the book of Exodus. This is the last Wednesday night of this quarter. Starting next quarter, we're going to continue this class because we are only in chapter 25 of Exodus. But we believe we can definitely, yes, I believe I can do it. And I'm going to do all my best to get us to chapter 40 in Exodus to finish out this wonderful book. And so we're going to be focusing on that this tonight and then continuing next Wednesday. Now, next Wednesday, our missionaries should be on the plane and maybe even landing. Do you know what time you're supposed to land in Italy approximately? All right. Okay. Well, we're excited for y'all. One of the things that we want to do, we're now in chapter 25 of the book of Exodus, and hopefully the last few weeks, if you've been with us, I've got some pretty good feedback that hopefully we've taken what a lot of people might consider some pretty mundane parts of the Bible, all these laws and things like that, and hopefully given a little bit more meaning to it, help you see how it actually still applies in principle to our lives today. And it's still useful for us to study the book of Exodus. I'll never forget the first time I really took a deep study of Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And I just remember reading and studying into it, realizing, wow, how much this applies to my life, how much better of a person I need to be. Reading the Old Testament. We're not under the Old Testament. These laws do not apply to us, but yet they bring out God's nature and what God expects of His people. We are God's people, and so a lot of these same principles translate right over into Christianity, and that's why it's important for us to understand these things that we read about in Exodus. Now, another thing, too, we're getting into chapter 25. We're getting into the tabernacle, and you think, well, this is an old tent, that they used to worship in. Why do we need to know about the tabernacle? Well, if you understand the concept of type and shadow, you should be able to see the correlation between the Old Testament and the New Testament. You cannot read the book of Hebrews without the Old Testament, understanding the Old Testament and understand a single thing that he's talking about in there. And there's a lot of wonderful messages, principles, concepts, precepts in the book of Hebrews, just that alone, as well as other letters in the New Testament that all have to do with understanding Old Testament concepts and Old Testament things that are in there. So tonight we're going to start in chapter 25. We made it to verse 10 because last week we talked about how he calls Moses up and says to make me, back up to verse 8, and let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them. I called this one of the golden verses of the Bible because how wonderful is it that the God of the universe, our Creator, wants to dwell on earth among His people. How blessed we would be to be the Hebrews of this day and age, of Him saying this to Moses. And He says, I want you to mark verse 9 because you're going to see this verse repeated several times, and it's a very important principle. When we talk about principles that translate from the Old Testament to the New Testament, verse 9, and some of the following ones that we'll see, is one of those principles that applies. For example, it says in verse 9, he's talking about this sanctuary, according to all that I show you, that is the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all of its furnishings, just so you shall make it. In other words, if I can paraphrase, he is saying, I'm going to give you the blueprints. I'm going to give you the instructions of how I want these things constructed, and you are to make them exactly the way I want them. Now, I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to build a house or work with a contractor or something like that of your own house or something that you're remodeling. Have many of you had that opportunity to build a house or remodel or something like that? Now, typically, if I'm not mistaken, and this happens to me all the time, but they'll get in and start working, and what do we typically do? No, I want it a little more to the right. Or, no, I want a different shade of white. Or, no, what I really want, you understand what I'm saying? Do y'all do that? Or am I the only one that does that? I am very particular, and I expect high quality, especially if I'm paying for high quality. I want them to do a good job. Paraguay drove me nuts because in Paraguay, they have a saying, it's called vai vai. It means ugly, ugly. And it basically means, hey, it looks good for my house. You know, they just want to get the job done and get home. All right? So you need to be right there and literally watch everything that they do. God is saying in this verse, I'm giving you the blueprints. With no uncertain circumstances are you to make it any other way than the pattern I'm about to give you. Make it exactly that. Just so, he says. Keep that in mind as we're reading through this. Now, how does that translate? Just that principle alone, how does that translate into the New Testament Christianity? Make it according to the pattern, just so. Do we have this in New Testament Christianity? I hear sure. So, well, what was it? Give me some examples. Steps of worship. So we have certain acts of worship that we do. We need to do it exactly. We know if we do those things, we're doing it right. Did you have your hand up? Church discipline. Exactly. Yes? Jesus says, I am the way. So there's not another way of going. Just so. Any other examples that come to mind? Yes. Salvation, this plan of salvation. How do you get there? Are we allowed to change the pattern? And that's what we need to understand. There is a pattern, and that's why I love this section of the Bible, because I can go to this section. If I'm teaching somebody the plan of salvation, the 5 acts of worship, and things like that, and I can say, listen, God is very serious about patterns. In fact, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Romans chapter 6, verse 17, thanks be to God that you obey that form of doctrine. Form is the word tupos, which means a pattern or a model. And you can actually see that pattern. Remember we talked about that, how Jesus was living, he died, he was buried, he rose again and went on to live again. That's what we do. We're living, but we die to sin. We're buried in baptism. We rise up in newness of life and go on to live in faithfulness. The same pattern. That's what God is showing here, showing this pattern. But this is what I said a minute ago, type and antitype. Type and shadow. It's for example, if I put my hand up and show, and you can't really see it because we got so many lights, but if I put my hand up, you could see my hand is a shadow. This is the type, this is the shadow. It's showing you, this is not really my hand, but it gives you an idea that there's a hand there. And that's what we're doing with the tabernacle and things like that. Okay, so we get into verse 10. And they shall make it. He's talking about this sanctuary. Now what he does here is he starts with the most holy of the holiest things. All right, you're going to make this tabernacle, this sanctuary, this tent of meeting for me. And so the first item that he lists is this Ark of the Covenant, the most holy thing of all the tabernacle. And they shall make an ark of acacia wood. 2.5 cubits shall be its length, and 1.5 cubits its width, and 1.5 cubits its height. Now, if you've been reading your Bible and you go back to Genesis chapter 6, there was somebody else who made something like this, right? Noah made an ark. His was much bigger than this, right? Now, interesting thing is it says make an ark of acacia wood. So is he making a boat? What is he making here? Actually, what's going on, this is where translation comes in with a problem in translating the Hebrew language. This was written in Hebrew. You're dealing with 2 different words. The word in Genesis chapter 6 is a word that actually means something like a vessel. Okay, but this word here, the word ark here in this particular verse, chapter 25, verse 10, is more of a chest or a box or actually kind of like a coffin. So what he's saying, in fact, I think some of your versions probably say that. Do you have in your versions something other than ark? Okay, it depends. There are certain versions that call it a chest, call it a different name. All right, so here, make this chest or this box of acacia wood. Last week we talked about acacia wood is a type of wood that is found there in the desert, in the area of Sinai where they're at. It's a very, very hard wood. Now, why would that be important? They're termites, so that you can't be destroyed. I mentioned to you that Paraguay has some of the hardest wood you've ever seen. It's called lapacho. They're also the most beautiful, one of the most beautiful trees I've ever seen. Do you remember my reports? I would show you the lapacho trees that had the yellow flowers and the pink flowers and stuff like that. And the whole city would light up with those flowers. I love Asuncion in August. And Asuncion was founded, the city was founded in August. I know why. Because whatever his name was, Cortez or somebody came ashore, all those flowered trees were just incredible. Well, that tree is so hard, it ranks up about in the top 10, I think the top 5 of the hardest index of all trees in the world, that you can't hardly cut through it, or you can use it, it just takes special tools and special handling. That's what the acacia wood is, very, very hard wood. And you shall, verse 11, you shall overlay it with pure gold. Inside and out, you shall overlay it and shall make it a molding of gold all around. Now remember, in verses 1 through 8, he's asking the people to give a free will offering. This is where this gold and stuff came from. Remember when they left out of Egypt, they plundered the Egyptians. The Egyptians probably just gave them all this stuff, said, please, go, get out of here. It caused enough trouble. And they left there with all kinds of jewelry and things like that. We're going to see this in a little while when we get to the golden calf, that they had plenty of gold. So they were to give this free will offering. So ladies, can you imagine, men too, if you happen to have jewelry. So Sunday morning, this coming Sunday, we're having a special offering. We need a special offering for this, whatever subject we want to see. And what we want is we need materials. We need gold and silver and bronze, and we need yarn and thread and different materials. And so when you come on Sunday morning to worship, you're going to bring in your earrings, your rings, your watches, your different things. Like, can you imagine passing around the collection plate? Man, by the time it got back here, if it was gold, it would be pretty heavy, wouldn't it? But that's what they did. They gave this voluntarily to the Lord. And so they used this gold to overlay it. And you shall cast 4 rings of gold for it, and put them in its 4 corners. 2 rings shall be on one side, and 2 rings on the other side. And you shall make poles of acacia wood, and overlay them with gold. You shall put the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark, and that the ark may be carried by them. The poles shall be in the rings of the ark, they shall not be taken from it. Okay, this is an important point to understand, because later on we see how serious God is about not touching the ark. So what happens is you build this box. He wants you to put these rings on it. And I forgot that I have these pictures, so we can go to the tabernacle here. We'll talk about all these pictures in just a few moments. But if we get to this, what's called the Ark of the Covenant, here is a pretty good picture. You can see an artist. We have no idea what it looks like. You know, I know what a lot of you are thinking. Well, hey, Indiana Jones, he found it, right? So we know exactly what it looks like. I don't know if you've watched that show. By the way, they put those on Netflix. This is not an advertisement for Netflix, but they put those on there. All of a sudden, they're all on there, and those things are from way back in the 1980s. And Andrew and I were watching those, and we watched this one. And the man, I didn't never notice this before, but the man standing behind there when they got ready to open up the ark, he had on the high priest uniform or outfit. And I'm thinking, where did he get that? And not only that, he's German. He's not Levi. He can't wear that. So it was an interesting detail that only a Bible student probably picked up on. All right, so you have these poles that go through there so that you can lift it, so that you can carry it. All right, and you're going to see later there's even a covering that goes over it whenever it is being carried. Now this is, again, important to understand. I want you to keep your finger right here and go to Numbers chapter 4. Numbers chapter 4, verse 15. And we start to see how serious this is. Now think about Numbers chapter 4, Numbers chapter 4 is before Numbers chapter 10. What happens in Numbers chapter 10? Anybody remember? Nadab and Abihu. Remember that story? All right, so here's before Nadab and Abihu, verse 15. Steve, do you have that verse there? Numbers 4, verse 15.
Then Aaron and his sons had finished covering the holy objects and all the furnishings of the sanctuary when the camp is to set out. After that, the sons of Kohath shall come to carry them, so that they will not touch the holy objects and die. These are the things in the tent of the meeting which the sons of Kohath are to carry.
Okay, so by the time we get to the book of Numbers, and we're going to touch on this a little bit later on, he is now not only giving all these instructions of this furniture that goes in the tabernacle, but he even gives instructions of who is allowed to carry it and when. And so in this case, it's the sons of Kohath. But notice what it says. The main thing I want you to get out of this verse, it says, but they shall not touch any holy thing, lest what? Lest they die. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with this story, but turn to 2 Samuel 6. Go ahead and keep your finger in Exodus, but 2 Samuel chapter 6. I'm going to remind you of this story, this account. Many years later, this is now we're getting into the time of the kings, King David, in fact. And King David gathers up his men, and he's bringing the Ark of the Covenant up to Jerusalem. He wants to bring it to Jerusalem. And they put the Ark of the Covenant on a cart. Now, God said, carry it with these poles. So there's the first thing you should keep in mind. They put it on this cart, and then the cart heads out. And then if you look in verse 6, 2 Samuel 6, verse 6, and when they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. So the ark is up there, this precious object, which, by the way, the ark is precious and it became even more important to the Israelites because it became to represent the presence of God himself. In other words, if you had the ark, you were good to go. You had God right there with you. So that's how they associated directly with God. So they put it on this cart. The ox stumbles, and the cart starts to tip over. And can you just imagine all these people, and you see the ark slide to the side? What would everybody in the whole room do? Right? The ark, because it's just a small box. I don't know how big it is. Well, we do. Actually, we have the size. I'll talk about that in a second. But you have this box that's about to fall off. And so you would think, here's this wonderful, blessed soul that's going to protect it. Verse 7. Then the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and God struck him there for his error, and struck him, and he died there by the ark of God. What did God say in Numbers chapter 4, verse 17? Do not touch. So this is many years later, and I love this argument. I love using this when I say argument, I'm talking about debating type thing, when you're talking to somebody. This is a great explanation of the fallacy of time or age does not make it right. You know, sometimes people use that argument. Well, that's old-fashioned, or that's an old thing. Not so anymore. This shows right here, this is hundreds of years later, God hadn't changed his mind. Do you have something? And good intentions will not get you. Exactly. Uzzah probably meant very well, but he broke the law. Let's go back to Exodus chapter 25. We're talking about, I mentioned a minute ago, we don't know its size. I should have mentioned this when we read verse 10. We don't know exactly the size of a cubit. We have a pretty good idea. But this chest would be about 3.5 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet. So you're talking about this long, about this tall, about this wide. All right? So small enough to carry and easy enough to put into this area, because it goes into a specific area of the tabernacle. He'll explain that. Okay, so we understand why we carry it. Verse 16, and you shall put the ark of the testimony, you shall put into it the ark, the testimony, which I will give you. All right, here again is where the New Testament can help us understand a little bit more about what's going on here. We're going to read, as you continue reading the Old Testament, you're going to get to these points, but it's summarized in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 4. We'll look in Hebrews chapter 9. Let's see here. Do you have that? Hebrews 9:4? That's all right. Anybody? Scott, do you have it? Oh, go ahead, Oscar. Yes, sir. That's a great point, because we're going to get to that in just a second. But right now, you look in, he's going to say that in a moment in Exodus. But you look in verse 4, what's inside this chest? Whenever he says here in verse 16 of 25 of Exodus, and you shall put into the ark the testimony which I'll give you. What does Hebrews 9 tell us? It was those 10 commandments, those stones that he wrote, the finger of God wrote those on. But not only that, we also have what? We have Aaron's staff and a bowl of manna. That's interesting. Now, obviously, as you continue to read in the Old Testament, you'll see why those were put in there. But that's in Hebrews, you have this summary of what's going on. So, going back now to Exodus chapter 25, continuing in verse 17, you shall make a mercy seat of pure gold. 2.5 cubits shall be its length, and 1.5 cubits its width. And you shall make 2 cherubim of gold, of hammered work. You shall make them at the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make 1 cherub at one end, the other cherub at the other end, and you shall make the cherubim at the 2 ends of it of one piece with the mercy seat. And the cherubim shall stretch out their wings above, covering the mercy seat with their wings, and they shall face one another. The faces of the cherubim shall be toward the mercy seat. You shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony that I will give you. Now, before we continue, let's talk about what's going on here. One, so you have this chest, this box, and now he's saying put a mercy seat on it. That is actually a mistranslation or an unfortunate translation. Really, in fact, some of you, depending on what version you have, might have a different word there. What do you have in verse 17? Does anybody have anything different than mercy seat? You shall make a mercy seat of pure gold. What was that, Angela? An atonement cover. Okay, anything else? Throne of mercy. Okay. Anything else? All right. The NIV uses the word cover. Okay, and the CEV uses a lid. A lid. All right, because really the word that is there in the Hebrew, not certain exactly why they call it a mercy seat, but it's kind of a transliteration or a mistranslation of a word that simply means lid. You shall make a lid, a top for the box. Okay, that's really all it is. Make a top for the box, and on this top, I want you to put these 2 figures, these cherubs, these cherubim. Now, as we just read in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 5, what did it tell us? Of these things, we don't have much detail. We don't know exactly what these things look like. We have an idea of what they can look like. And if you look, there's several places in the Bible. Genesis chapter 3, verse 24, if you want to write that down. Ezekiel 10, 14 through 15, as well as Revelation 4, verse 6, uses that word again, and there gives some very interesting description of different faces, multiple wings, and things like that. So it depends on this description that you get of what these cherubim look like. All we do know is that according to Exodus, they had what? They definitely had wings, and they definitely had a face. That we know. Okay? We don't know if it was a human face. We don't know if it was a bird face. We don't know what it was. But it was some kind of being that the Israelites would know what it looked like. They certainly would understand this, because this isn't the only place that God tells them to put these cherubim.
In a lot of religious art, cherubim are so often depicted as really small children, toddlers or something, and yet cherubim were stationed in the Garden of Eden, the verses,
Mm-hmm.
to keep Adam and Eve from coming back in. And it says, and they had a flaming sword. I don't really see a 2-year-old swinging a big broadsword, or but a sword. So I don't think that. I mean, it's nice artistically speaking, but I don't think that's totally accurate.
What a great point. So thinking about that, we just said in Genesis with that description, these are obviously formidable beings. They're not little children or babies or anything. So
It might be different kinds of cherubim too, because in the book of Revelation they have face on each side,
Mhm.
front, and back.
now don't confuse the cherubim with the beast. I mean, not the beast, but the 4 living creatures around there as well. They can sometimes be confused with those. Okay, so all of this for a specific reason. Here's the specific reason, continuing now in verse 22. All right, so you build this box, you cover it in gold, you put these rings in it. Now I want you to put these poles in it to carry it. Do not touch this thing. And on top of it, I want you to build this lid with these winged creatures on the top of it. And once you've done all that, verse 22, and there I will meet with you, and I will speak with you from above the lid. Above, here it says mercy seat. And between the 2 cherubim which are on the ark of the testimony of all the things which I will give you and command to the children of Israel. All right, this is why the ark is so holy. Okay, let me now back up just a little bit. And if we look at the tabernacle itself, so we have this tabernacle. Let me just back up and get an overall picture. There is a replica of the tabernacle in Israel that you can go to. We don't know exactly what it looks like, but we can get a pretty good idea from what we read here. And so they've built a replica there in Israel that you can go and visit and walk inside and see. Now, we'll talk about the campment around it, but some more pictures, and then here's as they're putting it together. But the most important thing about the tabernacle is you'll see and begin to see in this picture, is these different pieces of furniture. And we're going to talk about each one of these pieces of furniture, but right now I want you to notice that there is one room and a second room. And this is important to understand because here, this room and the second room. He's going to explain this as we continue going further in the detail and instruction of the tabernacle. Now, it's in this second room, so if you're looking here at this cutaway, so we've got these curtains and stuff that we're going to talk about next week. You got this cutaway. Here's one room. This is called the Holy Room, and then this is the Holy of Holies, or Most Holy. All right, it's in this area right here that the Ark of the Covenant is to be placed. It's in that area, right there is another way of illustrating that. It's in that area that the high priest will go into. We're going to be talking about that when we get to chapter 28, how important that is. And only the high priest goes in there. So only the high priest and the ark and God are in those places, and Moses has the privilege of going into that place and meeting with God and being able to converse with God. That's why the ark is considered so important and became known as his presence. Any questions before we dismiss? Yes, Oscar. Very excellent question. That's actually in the book of Numbers. He goes through and he lays everything out. Not only how they were to tear it down and how often, but then what order they were to go and who was supposed to carry it. Now, we don't know the exact numbers, but we can calculate from what we read in Numbers and Deuteronomy how many times that they moved around. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a cover that goes over the ark. So everything has its procedure to be able to move this tabernacle. We know that this tabernacle, it was built there in Sinai, wound up all the way up in the land of Canaan, and was right there at the foot of Mount Ebal and Gershom. And I'm saying that right? Ebal and Gershom? Right at the foot of those two mountains. Okay, so we didn't get through chapter 25, but I promise you we are going to start going a lot faster. The ark is very important. The other things, we can start hitting those a little bit in chunks. So, amen. Everything about the tabernacle, everything that God has given right here parallels with Christianity, and you can see it. And the Hebrews writer says that. He shows exactly what the purpose of all that is. I hope you're finding this interesting. We'll continue this next Wednesday night. Have a great rest of your week, and God bless.